Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Neil Boothby, professor and director of the University of Notre Dame's Global Center for the Development of the Whole Child. Our center operates in 26 countries with the goal of creating pathways out of adversity for the world's most vulnerable children. The first 1,000 days are a time of tremendous potential and enormous vulnerability. How well or how poorly mothers and children are nourished and cared for during this time has a profound impact on a child's ability to grow, to learn, and thrive. This is because the first 1,000 days are when a child's brain begins to grow and develop, and when the foundations for lifelong health are built. Our ND, our Think ND series, Raising Resilient Children, explores the science of early childhood development and how parents, health professionals, and the Catholic Church can positively shape children's future outcomes. Our first episode offered insights from the fields of neuroscience, biology, early childhood development into how human relationships, nutrition, and environments in the first 1,000 days between a woman's pregnancy and a child's second birthday shapes future outcomes. Our series after this, our podcast after this, next time we'll explore how Notre Dame is aligning this new science and the lived experiences of families and decision makers across a diversity of sectors, cultures, and political values to offer pathways forward for individuals, communities, and nations. Today, I'm here with Father Lou DelFra, a Holy Cross priest who serves as director of pastoral life at the Alliance for Catholic Education here at the University of Notre Dame. Lou and I are going to discuss the science and theology of relationships and belonging and how Catholic social tradition paints a directive to address the needs of those on the margins of society, while science in turn shows us how to do so. Welcome, Father Lou.
Thank you so much, Neil. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, this will be fun. This will be fun, Father. Before we begin, I just want to thank all the sponsors and co-sponsors of the Raising Resilient Children series, the Global Center for the Development of the Whole Child, the Institute for Educational Initiatives, and of course, Notre Dame Alumni Association. So, Father Lou, here we go. Today's session explores how early childhood development science and Catholic social traditions intersect. So, Lou, you and I wrote a book on investing in our youth, and it was based in part on the premise that there's a complementariness between science and faith. What do you see as that complementariness, and why did we write this book?
Yeah. I think it's a timely book in the sense that I think one of the things that's come up in our society and culture is the idea that either you believe in science or you believe in faith claims, and that they're not compatible. It's an either or, and that's never been the Catholic tradition. The Catholic tradition has always been that it's a both and for a very good reason, which is simply this: that we believe that the God who created the natural world, which can be explained scientifically, right, is the same God who created the supernatural world, which is explained through revelation and faith. And so, because it's the same God who created both, those two worlds are ultimately compatible. And we should see correspondences between what science can discover and the truth claims about God and the human person that our faith makes, that there's ultimately a complementarity. And of course, at times throughout history, there can be a case where it looks like the two are incompatible. But all the church would say there is, we just don't know enough on one or the other side yet. But we hold on tight to this idea that God created both the natural and the supernatural, so that they're ultimately complementary.
That's great. That's great. Thanks, Father. I've joked in the past a little bit when I came to Notre Dame, there's been several surprises, one of which I never thought I'd write a book with a Catholic priest, which was delightful. We started off as a conversation exploring the dialectic between faith and science. Then we recorded it and we turned it into a book. And from my perspective, the book was a very important tool for the work we're doing with like parishes and churches in different parts of the world, in particular Haiti and Kenya, where we have, for example, in Haiti, an opportunity. The head of the Catholic Church in Haiti has invited us in to work with seminarians, both priests and sisters, during their formation period, where we can start talking about this dialectic between faith and science and how it instructs us really to raise our children. So I'm really grateful, Lou, that we were able to have this conversation and the conversation continues. So
Yeah. And I hope
thank
you don't feel too bad talking with a priest. I was an English guy myself, language arts. My high school science teacher would be like, is going to have a heart attack if they see that I'm having a dialogue with a scientist. So don't worry.
that's brilliant. That's brilliant. So I'm going to say a few words about the science of relationship and why children need champions in their life, and then I'm going to ask Father Lou to talk really about the sort of theology of relationships and belonging. And I think we'll see that there's actually quite a complementary story to be told here. So I think that recently breakthroughs in neuroscience with the ability, like neuroimaging, where we can actually go in and see how brains are developing in real time, human development sciences, the economists that study human development. There's kind of this convergence of science that shows really how critical that first 1,000 days of life are in terms of cognitive development and social emotional competencies. And for example, if we look at the normal complement, the normal amount of neurons that young children have, we're talking about 1 billion neurons within those first 1,000 days of life that are being built. So that's like the infrastructure, the capacity, the intellectual capacity of our brains. That means essentially every minute, 250,000 nerve cells are being created. So that's an enormous amount of intellectual capacity or infrastructure. And what happens with that is that babies just initially start trying to understand all that's going on around them and make sense out of the world and make the world a kind of a predictable place. So the extent to which we can respond to children's needs, babies' needs, when they cry, we pick them up and comfort them. When they're hungry, we feed them, we talk to them, we sing to them. That social interaction is informing that neuron development. And kids are able to look at the world as a predictable place. And so what I think parents need to understand is that by doing loving your children and feeding them well, you're actually building brain capacity. You're informing all that neuron work that takes place. And we see, for example, within the first 2 months of life, whatever language is being spoken to the child, her brains are already morphing into a sensitivity towards those signs and strengthening those connections. But you're also then seeing the beginning, actually, a pruning of neurons that aren't being used. And that's just one example of how magical this time is. The last thing I'll say before turning over to Father Lou is that through the epigenetic process, we understand now that social experiences, children's experiences, actually come in their bodies, into their biology through epigenetic signatures, which turn genes on and off and whatnot. And it's a miracle when you think about the reality that when we love our children, when we pick them up, when we hold them, that actually is becoming part of their biology. And it's the biological origins of resilience, for example, or if they're neglected, risk. So we're wired for relationships. We don't come into the world outside of them. We don't survive outside of them, and we don't thrive outside of them. And I'm wondering, Father, how that sort of coincides with the theology of relationships and belongings, and where, perhaps even where that's most evident in the Christian story.
Yeah. Yeah. It's actually a great test case for what we were saying at the beginning, that there should be some complementarity between what our faith reveals to us about the human person and then what science winds up discovering about brain development, for example. So here's a really good example. You take like the Genesis story of the creation of the human, which is not meant to be a scientific account in the Catholic understanding of that scripture story. It's not meant to be a scientific account of the creation of the world. Um, but rather through the use of allegory is trying to reveal some things about the human person. And so you look at that creation story, In the first creation story, God's going through creating the whole world, the light and the darkness, the land and the sea, the plants and the animal. And after each day of creating those things, God looks down on what God has just created and says the words, "It is good." And then when you start looking at the second creation account, because there's two, um, God gets to the creation of the second of the human person, the pinnacle of creation. And it's really interesting. God messes up. God creates a single solitary human being. We've been through 5 days of it is good, it is good, it is good, it is good. And God looks down at the single solitary human being in Genesis. And the first words out of God's mouth are, "It is not good. It
Mm.
is not good for that one to be alone." And God puts it right back to sleep. And we know that the story takes out this rib and creates a second human person. And now they're supposed to live with each other and they're supposed to live for each other. And then and only then, when there's two of them and they're in relationship with one another, do we get this beautiful revelatory claim about the human person that science could never come up with because it's not scientifically discoverable. Um, in the image and likeness of God's own self, God created them. But only when they can love, only when they can be in relationship with each other, only when there's two, do we get that beautiful revelation in the image and likeness of God is the human person created.
Mm.
So it's like, what's Genesis trying to tell us? That a human being is only fully created when it's in relationship. And then you go back to everything you just said about what we've discovered
Mm.
about neurons firing when a baby's being related to, and how they don't fire when a baby's not being related to, when a baby's being neglected. And you see the compatibility, right, between a faith claim and scientific discovery.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. What about the Trinity itself, Father Lou? What does that tell us about relate?
Yeah. So we get this first claim that we're created in the image and likeness of God. Um, But who's that God? That's a beautiful saying, but it's like, we don't know who God is. So what does that really tell us about the human person? And so things get really interesting, it seems to me, when Christianity starts developing the doctrine of the Trinity, that our God is, if you will, one self-sufficient being, but is three beings in relationship to each other. Traditionally, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And it's like, what does that mean? There's a beautiful moment in the Catholic tradition, a beautiful little happening. It was a German mystic by the name of Meister Eckhart, and he was preaching on Trinity Sunday of all things, and trying to describe to the congregation what we meant that God is actually three people. And something happened to him after mass that's happened to every priest at some point, which is a parishioner came up and was like, "I have no understanding of what you were saying up there." This person had just had their first baby. So Meister Eckhart's trying to explain the Trinity. He says, "So imagine you're holding your baby, and your baby's asleep in your arms, and suddenly it wakes up, and its eyes focus, and it recognizes you. What inevitably happens when the baby recognizes its mom or its dad is holding? It smiles, right? The baby smiles, and then what inevitably does the parent do when the baby smiles? The parent smiles, right? And as Meister Eckhart wrote later in his spiritual journals, they start cooing at each other. They start making noises. They giggle at each other. And he wrote this. And that giggling begets pleasure, and the pleasure begets joy, and the joy begets love, and that love is the Holy Spirit.
Mm.
And the three of them together, parent, child, and the love between them. That's what I was trying to talk about in my homily on the Trinity, right? That God is actually the whole dynamic. If you showed people a photo of a parent holding its baby and said, what's the image of God? Likely the overwhelming majority of people say it's the parent caring for the child. But that's actually not what Meister Eckhart was saying, right? He's saying the whole picture is God. It's the parent loving the child being loved, and the love that's in between. That whole dynamic is who God is. And now graph that onto we're created in the image and likeness of that God.
Mm.
We're only fully human when we're in a dynamic of love.
That's beautiful. That's really compelling. And again, I think it just illustrates what the science tells us, which is that serve and return when babies reach out, either verbally or through cries. And those of us that are parents know how powerful a baby's cry can be in terms of getting our attention and whatnot. But that back and forth is what really does build healthy brains and cognitive capacities.
Mm.
So, Lou, when my firstborn, Peter, was born, my first son, I was present and he came into the world without a cry. And just looking at that, his face was just one of bewilderment. And it wasn't until the pediatrician sort of picked him up that he started crying. And I just had this profound experience or sense that Peter didn't belong to me, that he had come from somewhere and he was going somewhere. And my job, in a certain sense, he had been entrusted to me
Wow.
to be that sort of middle person, so to
Wow.
speak. And I'm curious, Lou, if we're made in God's image and we're God's children, what would you say from a Catholic social teaching or the church perspective? What are the roles and responsibilities of parents and caregivers in raising God's children?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. And Catholic social tradition does have some pretty amazing things to say here. If God created the human person to be essentially relational and social, as we've been talking about, then it seems to me each human person then has a right to be part of a nurturing community. And all of us have the responsibility to create such communities. The gift of our lives comes with rights and responsibility. That's I suppose the first claim of Catholic social tradition. Um, so each person born into the world possesses certain fundamental rights: the right to life, the right to food and nutrition, the right to shelter from harm, and the right to an education and formation of our mental capacities. And so, correspondingly, each person is entrusted with responsibilities to ensure those rights for other people. So together, we're all one human family, if you will. But then the Catholic tradition really puts a particular emphasis on the family as the first and the primary unit of community for a child. The child's first community um, is its family. And so, what Catholic social tradition would say is that parents have responsibilities to their children to ensure they're cared for, to ensure that they're fed, to ensure that they're well sheltered, and to ensure that their mental capacities are flourish. That's a responsibility entrusted to them as a family. And the Catholic tradition has this, I think, beautiful little phrase of calling the family the domestic church, the first place where a child's spirit just begins to thrive for the first time is actually the family as the domestic church.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Um, I guess from the science standpoint, just building on what you had to say, um, recognition of the human dignity in all of us is really central to positive development. And you mentioned the home as the domestic church. Learning starts really before birth. Babies can
Mm.
hear sounds and music and whatnot, and we actually can go in through neuroimaging and see the difference between newborns' brains that have been exposed, for example, to music and whatnot. It actually is different. It's physically different. Those neurons are already morphing into creating coherence. And so learning begins at birth, if not before. And what we know through research is that about 60 to 70% of achievement gaps between children who grow up in poverty and children who grow up, say, in professional families is evident before you even start preschool. So again, you and they call that sort of the 30 million word gap, the difference in terms of how many words a kid in a professional family will be exposed to versus a child, say, on welfare is 30 million. So just imagine being that far behind before you even start. And so this idea that the home is actually not only the first church, but it's the first school,
Yeah.
as well. These things come together and it really is the optimal time to invest in human development.
I serve in the Alliance for Catholic Education, and we're focused on what we used to say K-12 education. Of course, now it's pre-K, 12 education, and that whole emphasis, a growing emphasis on pre-K, has been in response to this notion that kindergarten's too late to start forming our child. And what you're saying is pre-K is too late. And there again, I think you see the wisdom in the church teaching that the family needs to be the first and primary educator of their child. Because what you're saying, it seems to me, is education begins from the moment that baby comes into the world. Even though pre-rational, if you will, the relationship that is forming has an impact on that baby's brain. And by the time that baby walks into pre-K, its brain is more or less well developed, depending on what's happened before the baby got there.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think we'll talk in a little bit about some of our efforts to survey a church system where we have the church tied to a school and then families go to each. And that really is a very powerful potential system, child development and learning system that the church is uniquely positioned to activate. But before we get there, adversity, neglect, abuse, whatnot really works in the opposite direction in terms of reducing intellectual capacity and reducing life expectancies, outcomes, et cetera. And I know that, Lou, that Catholic teaching encourages us to prioritize those on the margins of society. Could you talk a little bit into that space, please?
Sure. Yeah, and even like before, just to start with a concrete image before the kind of abstract teaching, if you think of so in the Catholic tradition, there's this beautiful devotion to Mary, right, as the mother of Jesus. And what are the two most prominent images of Mary in the Catholic Church, in the Catholic tradition? It's Mary holding the infant Jesus. It's Mary, the Pietà, Mary holding Jesus when he's taken down from the cross. In other words, it's Mary holding Jesus at his two most vulnerable moments. There's just not a lot of statues of Mary and a teenage Jesus walking around together. There's not a lot of images of Mary and Jesus in his public ministry. What is spoken to and what has been raised up through the century has been Mary with Jesus at his two most vulnerable moments. So I wanted to start with that image because
Yeah.
I think then Catholic social teaching just catches up with what's being revealed there, which is that, okay, so we've got these rights and responsibility as human persons, but then the Catholic social tradition is going to go a step further and say those responsibilities extend in a preferential way to the most vulnerable in our population. But what I call preferential option for the poor, that those who are vulnerable in a particular way are due added. We have an added responsibility to take care of them. That grows right out of the Gospels, right? And who Jesus winds up spending most of his time with, right? If there's a vulnerable person in the crowd, it's just like a magnet, right? He just right over to the leper, to the deaf person, to the blind person, to the paralyzed person. With a whole healthy crowd standing right around, he just shoots right in, right to the most vulnerable in the group, and that's where he spends his time.
Yeah, that's really something to reflect on. It made me think that something I read once, Roger Thoreau did a meta-analysis of all the ECD, early childhood development sort of research and literature includes, which I think is apropos to what we're talking about, is if you really want to shape the world, make it a better place, we have 1,000 days to do mother by mother, child by child. And I think it just speaks to the criticality of investing early, but also prioritizing pathways out of adversity for those that are on the margins of society. It just strikes me that these come together. If we look at that the question earlier or the issue earlier about school readiness, it may be a better matrix of poverty alleviation might be how many words a child is exposed to during her early years
Yeah.
than anything that might be more complicated, like changing social economic status. We can love our children and we can read to them, we can talk to them, we can play music. That are things that we can all do. We just have to know that's what's critical to raising our kids. Great. Um, So I'll just talk a little bit about what the Global Center and Notre Dame are doing through the church in several countries, in particular Haiti and Kenya, for example. And as I mentioned earlier, at the rural level, at the community level, in rural parts of the world, the Catholic Church sometimes is the only provider of education. So in Kenya, for example, about 40% of the total nation's education is provided through the Catholic Church. And it often is linked into government ministry. So the Ministry of Education, the school would be part of that national
Mm,
system, but it's run by sisters, for example, and it belongs to the church. So what you have is you have these schools that actually in the developing part of the world, demand to go to Catholic school is increasing. I know in this country, we're dealing with a different dynamic at the moment. But you have the church, you have a school that's attached to the church, and then you have families that go to each of those things. And if you think about raising resilient children, it really is, it takes so much of development takes place in the home, in the school. And for the 85% of the world that identifies as religious, in the church or the equivalent
yeah.
and whatnot. So here is this incredibly wonderful opportunity to engage these three pillars in a systematic way. So, for example, in Haiti, we're working with the Catholic Church. We're in, I think, 320 schools, 200 of which are Catholic. And in those parish communities, the school is the literacy, the numeracy, the social emotional skills development, um, the family. There's parenting empowerment programs which are introducing the science to parents. And then there's the church component, which, for example, the priests and the sisters are integrating positive child development messages in sermons, in pre baptism preparations, and in early during pregnancy, when couples or women are pregnant for the first time, getting them engaged in some of how we can raise resilient children. And I'm wondering if we could show a very short clip on what we call the L3 Equity Initiative in Haiti.
Haitians are proud of our heritage as the first independent nation of former slaves, but our history is also one of economic oppression. Today, Haiti is the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere with the lowest literacy rate and a government ill-equipped to serve our children. Notre Dame and local partners are fighting modern-day racial and class inequalities by investing in Haiti's most accessible system, the home, the school, and the church or L3. The L3 Equity Initiative will deploy evidence-based interventions within this network to advance holistic child development. Within the home, we will empower parents to use what they have to give their children the best start possible. At school, we will expand our literacy and socio-emotional learning programs and launch economic enterprises that build financial sustainability. Within the church, we will help religious leaders integrate positive parenting messages in sermons and baptism courses. The home, school, and church are Haiti's thriving heart where the lasting effects of racial inequities can be clearly seen, but also powerfully fought.
So again, this is just a short clip of what we call the L3 approach in Haiti that is engaging the church systematically and in terms of system development. And I think this is relevant in many parts of the world, and it's something that Notre Dame is uniquely positioned to do. I can't think of another university in the world that could backstop and inform these sorts of efforts.
Yeah, and again, just to attach it to what we were saying earlier, in such a credible way, right? Because of the compatibility
Yeah.
between science and faith claims. Church ministers, you think about the opportunities in marriage preparation with a young couple, or as you mentioned, before your first child is baptized, families usually go through baptism class. There's great opportunities from a theological, spiritual framework to talk about the importance of nurturing relationships in the first days of your child's life. And to do that from like priests and ministers can do that from a spiritual viewpoint, but arrive at the same, if you will, at the same place that a child psychologist might or a social worker might arrive, which is, listen, those 1,000 days have got to be filled with words, have got to be filled with touch, have got to be filled with love.
Yeah.
So it's beautiful. And I agree with you. Gosh, because of Notre Dame's particular commitment to faith-based institutions, we've got an entree there that can be very powerful.
Yeah. Again, if you're raising children in the United States, for example, your pediatrician is a key go-to person in terms of helping you think through these issues. In many parts of the world, women are not able to go and do the neonatal health. And so the question becomes, who is the key messenger in terms of getting this information out? And in Haiti and Kenya, for example, the church is a very powerful institution, a very powerful voice, and priests and sisters can be quite influential in informing people, but also helping to shape mindset shifts, behavioral change, and whatnot. So there's a built-in advantage with religious leadership in terms of being able to be a messenger that can produce change. Father Lou, before we sign off here, I just want to circle back to, for some reason, listening to you talk earlier, this whole question of the need to belong or belongingness, like the theology and science of relationships and belonging and whatnot. And I know that World Health Organization just recently came out with a global report that's saying loneliness now is one of the key challenges when it comes to morbidity and mortality, people being alone. And I'm just curious with your thoughts on how might the church engage more in addressing in this country, for example, as well as overseas or in other countries, the need for youth to belong to something that's bigger than themselves. That seems to be a challenge in today's world.
Yeah. Oh gosh. We have mass in our dorms here at Notre Dame every Sunday night, and they're usually pretty tired by then, especially if there was a home football game that weekend. And so trying to get them focused in on your homily on a late Sunday night can sometimes be a challenge. But if you talk about loneliness, you can just feel the whole room lock in. People are experiencing this. And it's been amazing how oftentimes, this is not a blanket claim, but social media, which should make us and does make us more interconnected in many ways, has also ushered in incredible isolation and loneliness for whatever reasons that I'm not expert enough to talk about, but I know our young people are experiencing that. So yeah, this whole fraying of community, and I go back to that Genesis image of the single solitary human being, and
Yeah.
what happens allegorically? It goes to sleep. It's God puts it to sleep. It's lifeless. The single solitary human being is lifeless,
Mm.
and only starts coming into its fullness in the context of community and relationship. And so again, you think about family as the first community and modeling. If kids are experiencing from a young age the importance of relationship and community, what they then expect and contribute to for the rest of their life, and conversely, what they don't contribute to if they don't experience that in their family. And then the second really big community they often become a part of is school. And again, like I work in Catholic schools. Catholic schools usually take community building as a very explicit goal. And that not that they're the only schools that don't do, but they do so explicitly and engendering in children from a very young age. You're responsible for the kid sitting next to you and he or she for you, and building up these networks of, if you will, rights and responsibility, in which we now know, right, the human person thrives.
That's great. That's great. Father Lou, thank you so much. I always enjoy spending time with you, and I always find myself learning quite a bit that I go off and reflect on uh, and come back to some of these issues and challenges. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing, and from you, I got to go look up neurons now. No, I love seeing that compatibility.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I want to thank all of you for joining us in this conversation. We hope you find your experience with raising resilient children to be insightful and engaging, and that you stay connected not only to us here at the Global Center for the Development of the Whole Child, but to our global learning community on ND Think. So please visit the series page on think.nd.eu for additional resources. The video is there, the book is there, and whatnot, and it might be a fun read. We hope you and all the ND Think learning community will return for the final Raising Resilient Children event, where we discuss the ways the University of Notre Dame is bringing science of early childhood development and Catholic social teaching together to build pathways out of adversity for vulnerable children. Thank you all very much, and see you next time.